of right into the meat of it, is you started at the Brumbies for this season, joined them end of last year. The job that you had to do with the Brumbies is kind of similar to the job that you had to do with the Springboks when you took over at the start of your tenure. You had a young team, you're rebuilding, you don't have any real kind of stars. Is it the same process that you went through? And I'm quite interested to understand how you prepared this young Brumbies team. What were the pillars that you put in place and the success factors? You talk a lot about preparation and planning. So if you can talk us through, it's quite an open-ended question, but I'd love to know how you set up this team, because for the viewers that are watching this that don't know much about rugby union, the Brumbies have had an exceptional season. They're top of their division in Australia, but have come out from really kind of, I can say, nowhere in regards, because they are so young.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me say that to answer the question in a long way, what happened is it is exactly like the box. I mean, when I came here, I always waited for the right job, Jace. I always thought I was looking for a job where, after chatting to Eddie Jones, one of the things that he had done wrong in his time is he had taken the Reds job on after he was finished with the Wallabies. And he said to me the biggest mistake he ever made was going to the Reds, because if you remember correctly, they got hammered by the Bulls one year, about 90 points. And it sort of put him on the back foot, because every reputation or everything you work for, you can almost lose by the next job you take, And so when I say to you, when you ask me what's it like at the Brumbies, it was a job that I wanted to take. It was a job that I thought there was so many similarities for where the South African team was in 2004 to where the Brumbies were when I arrived here this time last year. And they'd come nowhere. They had a mass exodus of their senior players. They had just fired a coach halfway through a season. That's sort of unheard of in Brumby land, because they're very loyal people here, and they have this... it's a very family-orientated area here, and sort of to leave the coach out or fire him. He was a Canberra guy. He grew up here. He went to school here. It sort of left an ugly taste in the community. And saying that is that, therefore, when I arrived here, it sort of probably wasn't. It's probably never been on a lower ebb than it's ever been. The Brumby brand I'm talking about when I took over last year, and so when you say what is it that we did, I'd learned lessons from 2004 with the box. We had Gio Cronje and Quinton David saga. We had the Kom Staaldraad saga. We had been knocked out in the quarterfinals of the World Cup. I mean, as you would remember, 2003 was probably the lowest the Bok brand had also been. And so when I got here, I just stuck to the things that worked for me with the Boxers. I got here early. I only started literally, and as in my contract, and the season only started in November, December, as in pre-season, and the tournament only kicked off in February. But I got here in July, and I spent about 6 months getting things in place that I thought were going to be massively important for this year. So recruitment, making sure the environment was exciting, making sure the clubhouse was revamped, changing whatever it looked like inside in terms of bringing a bit of history and tradition back. So I got a couple of pictures of the old players there. Old players who had achieved, like Gregan and Larkham and Finnegan and Joe Roth and those sort of guys, went and put some of those pictures up and try to make it a little bit more of a sort of clubhouse where players who walked in there just sensed a sense of aura. And so again, no different to when I took over the box. The box, I introduced the braiding on the blazers. I brought in the old rugby jerseys, no skin tight jerseys. Not that I'm against skin tight jerseys, but went back to the colorings and of the green and gold jerseys. Made sure that the white sort of cricket jerseys they wore as number ones were important. And so what I'm saying, Jace, is I went back to the things that I knew and brought those things in. So the traditions, the values, the understanding of the legacy that was created before you. I went and asked George Gregan and Larkham to assist me. On the coaching staff, got Eddie Jones, who was a successful Brumbies coach, probably the most successful Brumbies coach, got him to be involved with the group, just as I'd got people involved with the box when I was involved with the box. Guys like Gert Small, who probably one of the best forwards South Africa ever had. And so, because I had been there and because I had done it and because I had the experience of what it was like to rebuild a franchise and a brand, I just brought those things with me to Australia, and there's no difference. Players who play rugby want to win. Players who play rugby want to be involved in an environment where they can play their best rugby, and we just stuck to those things. So I spent probably the first 6 months off the field, focused off the field. Obviously, it was on-field things with a bit of training, a bit of conditioning, but basically getting the off-field images right, and made sure that everybody who signed up, joined the Brumbies, arrived at the clubhouse, felt proud to be part of the Brumbies, made sure that things that we could do, that we could control in the rugby program, put into place. We got a full-time chef, got a full-time kitchen now in our clubhouse where the players get fed breakfast and lunch, which is again unheard of in terms of sort of rugby teams, not only in Australia, but I'm sure in all parts of the world, where you can get your own food and you get your own chef, your own supplementation. And yeah, I mean, I think all those things added up have obviously been beneficial because players are happy. I have them all living literally within sort of 2-3 k's of the clubhouse. Like, we can meet regularly. It's a small little town, so there's no reason why within one phone call no one can be at the clubhouse within 5 minutes. So there's a massive family orientation here, as I said, and gone back to the things that made the Brumbies successful in the past by not only introducing players who were part of it, but going back to the value systems and the sort of cultures that were very strong in Brumby land, in the early 2000s.
And that's one of the questions that I actually wanted to ask you is, how do you create that team culture, and how important is it bringing somebody like George Gregg and Steve Larkham into the mold? And is it more important, or what I'm trying to find out is the role that they play from a tactical skills perspective to an influence and leadership perspective on the players. How would you kind of break that down on a percentage rate and how important it is?
Yeah, well, it's I don't think you can ever quantify how much they mean tactically or how much they mean, off the field. I mean, the reality is, in their own little way, they give confidence to players who are involved in the team, and the feedback I get from a lot of the young boys who are in our squad is that it's fantastic to have them around and they share their experiences. Not all of them are on-field experience. Some of them are off-field experiences about what it's like to play for the Brumbies, or what the jersey means, or how the jersey was designed, or don't forget that in '96, when this franchise was established, George Gregan and Stephen Larkham and Joe Roffs and Owen Finnegans, they were part of the designing of the jersey, the emblem, the name, the song that we sing when we play games. And all those things probably got lost along the way, or taken for granted along the way. So they're tactically very clever players. They're tactically very clever and understand the game. They share their knowledge with those players as well, which is fantastic. But I don't think I can say that it's 60% knowledge and rugby sort of brains and 40% off field. I think it's such a great balance between what they offer, and it's a no-brainer because they're passionate about this place. They know that this place, as in the Brumbies and Canberra, were so meaningful in their rugby careers, and in their own way they can bring back those things and offer the next generation the same things that I suppose they learned over a period of 10 years.
Yeah. And Jake, what are the values that you try and instill in your players and your team that you find are important and are critical for success?
Look, again, I just very similar to what I did at the Boxers. I think that standards that are set before you are non-negotiable. I think that that's why I knew this job was the right job for me, Jason, because when I took over the Box, the Box have got an unbelievable record as a test nation. Brumbies, they've got exactly the same sort of aura and same sort of legacy that they've established. They've won 2 Super Rugby championships, and they only started in '96 as a franchise. They've produced, we've had 150 Brumby players play for the Brumbies in Super Rugby, and I think we've had over 75 Wallabies, which means 1 in every 2 that comes to Canberra becomes a Wallaby. That's a phenomenal record if you consider that the Crusaders have 1 in 4 becomes an All Black. So, when you say what are those things, I mean, the things that I sort of stress is that we need to understand there's a history and there's a legacy that are not negotiable. Those are standards that are set before us, and I'm really big on getting them to buy in and understand that part of that comes with a massive responsibility when they play for the Brumbies. And then I think also, as you've mentioned before, it's the whole preparation and planning aspect, is that I want them to be prepared and plan for every time they play, and that means conditioning-wise, mental-wise, tactically they've got to be astute as well. So we spend a lot of time on getting them to understand how we want to play, whether they can play like that from a conditioning point of view, and also mentally whether they understand what's needed in terms of getting the best out of them. And I've always said, if it's like going into an exam, if you're prepared and you've done your homework and everything falls into place, there's no reason why you shouldn't get success. And those are things that as I said, that I sort of instilled in the Springboks and try to take to the box setup. And obviously they work for us, and I think it's massive for me as a South African who's been there in the best team in the world, and bringing all those lessons to this young group of Brumby boys who aspire to be the best in the world as well.
Jake, when you started at the Springboks, there's the famous story of you pulled them all together and you said we're going to win the World Cup in 2007. Did you do something similar with the Brumbies? Do you have a big close goal? Have you timelined it? What is the vision that you set for them?
Yeah, I've said we want to win Super Rugby Championships, and I didn't say we'll win it this year because obviously I'd never worked with this group of players. I'd probably a bit lucky in that I knew the South African players. I'd coached a lot of them in the Junior World Cup, which we had won as well. So I knew that I could say in 4 years' time we'll be world champions, senior world champions, because I'd literally coached a team of 21-year-olds who had just won the Junior World Cup. And I knew that in 4 years' time, when they were all in the peak of their conditioning and peak of their careers in terms of 25 years old, 26, because that's probably the average age of those great sides, I realized that there's no reason why they wouldn't become the best in the world at that same level 4 or 5 years later. So, yeah, I knew with the balance of Monty and Osterrand and a couple of the older boys that were around, John Smith and those guys, the makings of the juniors like, Pedri Vandenberg, Juan Smith, Skalkberger, Fred Dupree, Ricky January, Ashwin Willemse, Jean de Villiers. The bottom line is I knew that those juniors were the best players in the world. There was no reason why when I put them together. So I didn't do the same at the Brumbies, but I have stressed to them that we want to be the best team we want to be the best Super Rugby team. We want to make sure that the standards that are set before us. And as I said, they've won 2 championships, which is phenomenal. There are not many teams who've won the tournament once. These guys have won it twice, and I think they've played in 2 or 3 finals, which is an incredible feat for a small franchise like the Brumbies tucked away in Canberra. And I just made it quite clear, I'm coming here. We're not coming here to make numbers. I want players who want to come to Canberra. I want them to become Wallabies, but more importantly, as a group, we've got an onus upon ourselves to become champions and win as many titles as we can. And that so far so good. We're still top of the Australian Conference, and if all things pan out the way that is, we get another crack at playing in the playoffs, which is a massive achievement for a young group like we've got.
Yeah. Kind of a trademark of every team that you've coached is that your players always talk about the incredible belief that they have. And they almost seem unbreakable and unshakable in that belief. And that's an easy thing to have when things are going right. Your Brumbies team have won close games, so it's almost cemented that. But how do you deal with the team when things aren't going right? And you've obviously been through that with the Springboks, and there's a lot of off-field stuff that we won't get into. But how do you pull that back when days are dark and friends are few, as you'll see on the back of taxis in Cape Town?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jace, let me say that, you see, again, I'm probably very fortunate in that I've been through the highs and lows of that system. And, 2006, as you can recall, I really had a disastrous year. I was flown back and I was under the pump and, talk about losing my job, literally going into the World Cup. And at that time, you obviously doubt yourself. You start wondering whether the things you've put into place are good enough. You start thinking, what are the things that are believed in that are changed or that are changing. And like players, you start losing confidence in yourself. But I think the lesson that I learned there is that you just got to be honest with the players. And I think the other thing is just stick to what works for you. You get picked to coach, and you've got to just keep coaching through those difficult times, and you've got to make sure that the coaching you do is as good a coaching. You can't be focusing on what if or the negatives. You've got to make sure you're focusing on the positives. But as I said, I think honesty as well. I think the players just need to know that the message is consistent and it's honest all the time. So, they say they're winning close games, they're happy, and obviously when they're winning, they're going to say those things. But when times are tough, you've just got to be honest to yourself, honest to the players. You've got to make sure you believe in those things you still believe in. And And from experience, you just have to then put your head down and do the things that worked for you in the first place. I mean, I think often what happens is you start doubting your own ability, and you start questioning the things that you're putting in place. And I think the lesson I learned in 2006, and Ian McIntosh was probably the guy who helped me with that the most. He said, just get back on the field and just get back and coach, and forget about what's happening back in South Africa. And that lesson has stuck with me because, if things had to go difficult in the Brumbies, I would just get back on the field and start coaching. And I think players pick that up. I think they pick up the fact that you're confident in your own ability, and that gives them confidence.
You've always been, and I'm glad you brought up Ian McIntosh, because you've always been somebody who has been humble enough to bring in outside advice. You get a lot of coaches and people in kind of top positions that don't want that advice, and I think that's been one of your trademarks, is you're open to what other people have said. Eddie Jones has obviously played a great role in your career, and you respect him a lot. Are there some kind of examples that you can give us of other people that you really respect that have helped you along the way and have given you great advice, and what that advice has been?
Yeah, look, I think that a couple of things that come to mind, Jace, when you speak to me like that is that I think that one of the things that I learned is that you can never know everything about rugby, and it's changing all the time. So you need to stimulate yourself and get people from outside to actually question you or throw ideas at you, because that brings the best out of you. And I think that, as you say, I've probably been fortunate enough to have people around me that I trust, and people that are around me that weren't also uncomfortable in me bringing other people in. Don't forget, bringing Eddie in was obviously fantastic for me, but it would have put a lot of pressure on guys like Alistair and Gert Small, who were the assistant coaches, had they not believed that it was the right thing for the team. So I've also been very fortunate in the people that I've surrounded myself with, that they've also seen the bigger picture. And, when you say, who else, I mean, there have been a lot of people along the way. Ian McIntosh is a guy who, as you know, who's been there, he's coached. He was probably the pioneer of having English-speaking, non-South African, non-Springbok rugby players taking over as a coach. I mean, he got it first, and then Kitch got it after that. And, before that, it was almost an unwritten rule that you had to be a Springbok, and you in a lot of ways, you couldn't be English speaking either. So, that was the history of where the sort of Springbok came from. And I'm talking about the coaching role. So, in a lot of ways, Heineke, who's not a Springbok player or ex-player, Peter de Villiers, who's not an ex-Springbok player, we probably got a lot to be thankful for the fact that Ian McIntosh got that job and as I said, was the pioneer for that. And he, in a lot of ways, helped me to understand the intricacies and the sort of detail that goes in behind the scenes of being a coach, coaching a national team like South Africa. And I think John Hart, who was an All Black coach, I spent a lot of time talking to him while I was the coach, and he'd also come off an unsuccessful World Cup campaign. And as I said, maybe didn't always, talk rugby to me, but talked a lot to me about lessons in New Zealand, about what it was like for him, who had been assistant coach in '87 and won, and then lost the World Cup in '95. Obviously that wasn't easy for him. He was. They had the favourite team though. They thought they would win it with the massive team they had in '95 and never won it. So I learned a lot of lessons from him as a rugby coach. I think when I look back, Nelson Mandela. Everyone uses his name, and I suppose in a lot of ways that's because of who he is. But for me, also, being in contact with him and chatting to him, he played a massive role in getting me to understand about humility and understanding of forgiveness and all the things that maybe aren't rugby related, but also just give you that perspective of what it's really like by meeting a guy like him. So, there have been a lot of guys along the way, and I think you're right, Jason. I think that's the secret, is getting people around you that stimulate you, that bring out the best in you. And I must say, the one thing that I'm really enjoying about Australia is that this is a sporting nation, and rugby is not their national game, but they've got Olympic athletes. They've got the Olympics coming up now. And the interaction I have with swimming coaches, with athletic coaches, with wrestling coaches, with, AFL, rugby league. I mean, it's unbelievable to see the knowledge and the intellectual property that they share here. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a secret to why they're successful in sport, is because they're not scared to show and discuss things that work for them. And that I've no doubt that come 4 years' time from now, when I'm finished coaching in Australia, I'm going to be a much better coach from the lessons I'm learning in Australia now.
So, Jake, and that is something about Australia that does set them apart. They're very professional. They are smart about how they coach their sports teams. What lessons would you bring back to South Africa and change about the South African way that we coach our teams and manage our teams?
I think that, I mean, again, this is, and I can speak from experience because I coached at the highest level in South Africa. They're a lot more detailed, yeah. And it's because of the way the kids grow up. They won't just do things for the sake of doing them. They'll want to know why they're doing them, and they'll need to explain to them what the reasoning and the rationale behind it is. I think the other thing about them is, they don't just always only do it on passion. I think there's a thought that the Aussies have a sort of saying where they say they'll have a crack and they'll have a go, and that's true. They really do have a full go at it. But one thing about them is they don't just all play on emotion. They think about what they're doing as well, and then they have a good feeling for what they're trying to achieve on the field. So when you say, I mean, those would probably be the two things that I think that I would bring back is just the detail. Not that we weren't detailed in South Africa, but even the sort of finicky things that are really detailed as well. I think that the sharing in terms of the intellectual property, I think that's another thing that I think I would get better at. And then lastly is just, I think that's just the thought that goes into the game. I think that there's a lot more, they can't bash people. They don't have the players that sort of can bash people in this physical game. They've got to work out ways in which they can maybe be a little bit more clever or a little bit more streetwise or a little bit more subtle in things that they're doing. And with that comes, a different mindset for the way you prepare. So there's a lot more planning and detail that goes into pre-game and sort of match day and analysis that I suppose we were used to in South Africa.
Jake, when you were Springbok coach, you probably had one of the, I don't know, especially the time that you took over as Springbok coach for those 4 years. I mean, nobody could believe the amount of pressure and rubbish that went on. And I think your job was rated up there with Barack Obama's position as the most stressful job in the world. Something that I read in Lance Armstrong's book when he got cancer, he walked into the cancer ward and one of the other cancer victims said to him, "We're the lucky ones." Pretty much because it reprioritizes, it shows you kind of what's important, and getting through a tough time is actually kind of a benefit. You've won the World Cup from it, so you've come out on top. But is it something looking back on that 4-year period that you're glad you went through and survived, and it's made you a better coach, a better person? Or is it something that you would still want to change the way that things were done?
Look, Jace, I think it's both. I think that I wouldn't change anything by the fact that I had that opportunity. And as I said, one of the happiest days of my life is when I became the national coach, because as a young boy growing up, that was always going to be a sort of step too far. I mean, as I said, an English-speaking, non-Springbok rugby player, if you had dreamt of being a Springbok coach, that was highly unlikely in those days. So to go through the ranks and then end up becoming the national coach of a country like South Africa, where rugby's number one, where, I always believed that we could become the best team in the world, and we obviously did. I mean, I think that for me is something I would never change. But And it did make me a better coach. It did make me a better coach by having to go through what I went through. I've no doubt that I'm a much better equipped coach now. Yeah, miles away from South Africa, coaching in a foreign country with players who grew up differently to the way that I grew up. And remember, they don't have rugby as their number one game. So it's not only the way they grow up, it's just about what rugby means here. So I have no doubt that has made me a better coach, and I wouldn't have changed it. But saying that, I do wish that things would change in South Africa. And in a lot of ways, it looks like the things have changed now. I think that if I read between the lines, or if I look at the teams that have been selected, and I see the sort of, the sort of things that are allowed and not allowed in terms of the way that they're allowed to select, in terms of overseas-based players. So who knows? Maybe in a lot of ways that was a watershed time for South Africa, winning the World Cup, having that sort of feeling of maybe things weren't maybe being done fairly, or things weren't maybe, maybe I wouldn't have done them that way. But as I said, I'm very thankful that I've had that chance. And would I have changed it? No. Would I have liked those things to have changed? Yes. I still think that for South Africa to be number one in the world consistently, there's going to have to be a long look at the way they do things, and And I speak now as a chap living miles away. There's no doubt that the whole world knows that if South Africa ever got it right and got those things that maybe don't assist in getting them to be number one, they will consistently be number one. And I think the world's scared of that because they know that that's the one thing that South Africa probably shoot themselves in the foot is by the way that within the internal or the way they run things or the way the motions and things that go in the rugby game, they probably at times they're their worst enemies.
I've often thought about that and have thought that Graham Henry must have been very satisfied when he saw the way that we were running things at this last World Cup, because there's no reason why South Africa shouldn't be number one all the time in terms of the potential in that. But okay, so I wanted to ask you as well. You've always been good at spotting talent, and well, I don't want to use the word talent, but potential in young players. What do you look for? Is it ability or attitude or both? How do you define who's going to be great?
Yeah, look, you know what actually happened is I've been very fortunate, and in fact, I've got through the same thing here. I found a boy who played club rugby. I was picked in the Wallaby side the other day. He hasn't played yet, but I mean, there's been talk in Australia for the fact that he was a local club boy, and all of a sudden, people have said, "Where did you find him?" You know, and I think one of the things that I sort of always relate to people is I remember, you know, Doc Craven was a legend in our country, and I remember someone telling me a story once that they were standing next to Doc Craven, and they asked Doc made a statement like he was at Stellenbosch at Kutsenberg watching a boys play, and he said, "That boy over there will be a Springbok." And the chap asked him, "Doc, how do you know that? You know, how do you know that that guy's going to be a Springbok? There's 1,000 boys on the field, and you've earmarked that one kid. What is it, you know?" And Doc always said, you know, that if you're the biggest or the strongest or the quickest or the most skillful or the tallest or whatever, the chances are you'd become a Springbok. And I know it sounds like a very basic thing, but that's probably what I look for. I look for something that's just a bit unique and that can do something that other players can't do on the field. And that, I suppose, is the place that I start off when I look at the game. I look for something that other players don't necessarily see or necessarily can do or can't do either. You know, that they sort of, it's a skill or it's something in the game that maybe someone else doesn't notice. And it doesn't always mean kicking the ball the furthest. It just means sometimes the way that he runs into position, or the time that he has when he has the ball in his hands, or the decision he makes when he's in the corner or whatever. And I think that I've been very blessed in that, as you say. I've been lucky enough to spot that, and you know, those boys they've all gone on to play, you know, many times, or they've done really well in rugby. And you know, as I said, I enjoy that part of the game. I enjoy going and seeing someone that maybe someone else hasn't noticed, and then you change his life. And part of it is not just spotting him; it's about how you then develop him mentally, you know, emotionally. What do you do to him? You know, how you build him up. What situations do you play him in? Which games do you play him in? You know, who do you play him against? I mean, that's also part of when you do spot a guy. How then do you get him to actually get through the system, or get through wherever he's got to get through to get to the top?
When you spot that those young players, is it like an aha moment for you? Do you get butterflies in your tummy and get quite excited? And
yeah, I do. That's the one thing, as I said, Jason. I just get such a thrill out of the fact that I just sometimes say to myself, I don't believe people haven't seen what I've just seen, you know. And then I think that part of the coaching thing that I enjoy then is then spending time with him to get him to repeat those things that happen naturally to him, and then putting him in a team where when he does those things, he just gets so much self-belief out of the fact that not only does the team do well, the players around him are just so thankful that that sort of skill set that he brings is the one they need for the game. So, yeah, I mean, I've just been very thankful. I looked again at the box side the other day. I see Pierce Spiess is on the brink of playing his 50th test. And if you consider, I mean, I think it's almost 15 out of 15 that played in the World Cup final have gone on to play 50 or more tests for South Africa. I mean, it's fantastic to know that, you know, those boys started as first caps, a lot of them first caps or second caps or relatively new caps when they joined the box setup. And all of them have gone on to play over 50, some of them over 100. So that's when you get a thrill as a coach, is being able to identify them, put them in a system, and watch them stay in a system and become the best in the world.
And that is what's great as well, is your legacy as a coach is still running quite strong in South Africa. And I was contemplating whether I should ask this question or not, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But how did it feel watching a team that you had put so much energy and passion into, just really kind of being their potential being floundered and not fulfilling what they could have done? And I know you said as well that after your 4 years, it was time for you to move on, and probably because of the bad way that you were managed. But if you had stuck with that team for another 4 years, their careers, your career would have been very different. South Africa would be different as a sporting nation.
Yeah, look, I mean, that you'd never know. But I mean, if you have coached, you always believe that you could make a difference. And I suppose that some of the coaches who are around will always say, you know, if I'd been the coach, you know, one can never plan that. I mean, if I told mates in sort of 2000 that I was going to coach the Springbok team and win a World Cup, my mates would have laughed at me. So it's not for me to say, oh, I think if I had that team, we would have won the World Cup again. I think that would be arrogant of me to say that, Jason. But how did it feel? I mean, I must be honest, there were times that I'd sort of struggled to watch it because I had put a lot of time into that team, and there were times that I sort of, as I said, I felt a little bit heart sore because if I had it over, maybe I would have stuck it out and tried to have another term in the Springbok setup. But you know, as I said, things have, you know, there's a healing process. I've now got another challenge, and I'm enjoying the Brumbies. But there were times, you know, if I'm really honest with you, there were times that I thought, gee, you know, maybe I should have stayed on, and who knows, maybe we could have been a team that wouldn't back-to-back World Cups. But one never knows those things, and it's easy to look back on hindsight and say yes, but, or yes, could have or should have. You know, it was difficult at the times, and I do miss it, and I did miss it. But, you know, life's moved on, and as I said, I've got some great challenges now. And, you know, again, who would have said 5 years ago that I would be living in Australia coaching a Brumbies team, you know? So, you know, life has some twists and corners. You'll never know where I'm going to be in 5 years' time again.
Jake, I want to go back to when you're talking about finding young talent, and you speak about nurturing that young player. And if you could go a little bit deeper for us on kind of a practical level, how you do that. You look at somebody like Brian Habana, who played exceptionally well under you, peaked almost at 2007 and has struggled with form and is getting it back this year. And you're talking about you spot someone based on their ability, but so much of it is mental and in the mind. So how do you actually manage a player and to bring out the best in them and to make sure that they have that confidence?
Okay, well, let me say, you know, if you use Brian as an example, I think that, and I'm only using him because you've mentioned his name. Brian joined the scene. Was a young boy, but hadn't even played in provincial rugby when we picked him for the box. And obviously, I took a lot of criticism because I wanted to know who this kid was, and the public said, "Oh, you know, it's unfair. How do we get this, you know, coloured kid? Is it just a quota selection? You know, is it transformation?" But I'd watched him play as a schoolboy. He was a scrum half at King Edward School, and I'd watched him play there. In fact, he was in the B and C team, and I said to him, you know, you carry on playing, you're going to make it one day. I mean, you could just see that he had pace, and he was a bit of a special kid in that he loved rugby so much as well. And anyway, he joined us, and we took 4 years together. And basically, my first year, end of the year, he got his first test against England, scored a try, came into the team the next year as a little bit more of a sort of permanent fixture, and then, as you know, became the leading try scorer in 2007. And I think one of the things that I suppose people don't know is I didn't let him do any media. I kept him out of the media. I didn't want to see his face on the TV. I didn't want to hear about how good he was. I didn't want him to be talking in adverts about certain things. I said, your time will come, you know. It's not about you, the new kid in town. I've got players who've got 50 tests like Oosterrand. I've got Brayton Paulsa. I've got you know, John Smith's a captain. Victor Matfield's been a captain of the Bulls. I really don't want you to be on the front page of every magazine or every, you know. And it's difficult because obviously at that time he's the flavor of the month, and it's difficult because people want, he's a brand, and I suppose his agent and people who looked after him thought that I was probably a little bit unfair, and that, you know, that was the sort of time that they thought they could actually, you know, maybe make a bit of money from the fact that he's now hit the ground running and he becomes a household name. And I suppose at times Brian probably wasn't too happy about that either, because, you know, as much as there were requests, I just said, you know, you're not prepared to do them, and I'm not going to send you into the media, and I don't want to see your face, and if you're going to do those things, I'm not going to pick you, because I think that you need to focus on rugby first, you know. And maybe, you know, maybe looking back, maybe the post-2007 World Cup, Brian then became another household name, and, you know, became a front page of magazines, and those sort of things. And then you start losing focus. I think that the thing that's got to always be in the back of all those players' minds is that rugby's got to come first. So, I use Brian as an example. I think now, again, maybe he's forgotten about the fact that he's worried about what he's saying and how he's doing things. He's now concentrating on his rugby, and I think the proof is in the pudding. I think he's playing a bit better now, and people are judging him as a rugby player as opposed to the face on every TV advert or the face on every billboard. So that would be an example, Jason, of when you say, how do you manage players? It's not just, it's about what you say to him in the change room. It's about when you pick him. We didn't pick him in a game against Namibia just before the World Cup, and I deliberately never picked him because I think to be fair, Brian had he was probably, I needed to have him fired up for the World Cup, and I wanted him to appreciate that it wasn't a given that he was going to play every game at the World Cup. So I played JP Peterson in that game against Namibia in 2007, and JP played really well. So all it did was it created pressure for Brian because he realized, gee, it's not a fait accompli that I'll be in every starting lineup. And I mean, what happened. He scored 8 tries in the World Cup and was and won the Player of the Year and won the Player of 2007 RB Player of the Year. So those are the sort of things that you do as a coach. But you got to make sure that as a coach you have your finger on the pulse. And as I said, I really believe those sort of players become better players in the long run because he's the most capped Springbok of all time of this group that's now going on. He's found his form again. He's now been looked up by the juniors as one of the key guys. And, as I said, I'm sure that those lessons he's learned have also stood him in good stead.
Jake, your leadership style is very comprehensive. Is it something that you've always been good at and you've always done things in that kind of way? Or have you kind of built on it, and do you use resources, and have there been books that have influenced you or people that have influenced you? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I think that when you're in a role like, I was a schoolmaster, and when you talk about leadership and running big business, or all the skills that you learn as a leader, I've probably been lucky in that I've had a few of those, but I've never been in a situation where I've had to use those skills. So I again, just like I use Eddie on the rugby field and just like I use John Hart, I also listen and discuss things with top corporate people who run companies, and I ask them about things like how do you handle staff, or how do you measure performance, I think that then you also use whatever you can and you develop your own sort of leadership style. And it's worked for me. I think running a rugby team, you've got to sort of be a bit of a leader in that you know exactly which way the ship's going to go. You've got to then make sure that you're the captain of that ship. You've got to make everyone feel inclusive. You've got to make sure that everyone that's part of it feels as though that they're getting recognition as well. I think the two things people enjoy is recognition and love, and those are things that are important as well in terms of being a leader. So, yeah, I mean, Jace, it's something I've learned over time. I do read books. I do read a lot of, and especially in Australia, again, I've been very fortunate in learning, as I said, from a lot of these top coaches who've been, they call it podium coaches, who've won gold medals at the Olympic Games and that sort of stuff. And I pick up what's worked for them when they've dealt with elite athletes. And I was very fortunate in 2004. I spent some time with Miami Dolphins, and I spent some time with Miami Heat basketball team, and I met a guy called Pat Riley there, who's revered in America as a real basketball leader and a basketball coach, and spoke to me a lot about how he handles guys like Shaq O'Neal and Michael Jordan and players like that. So, yeah, I've made a sort of point of spending a bit of time with people who run not only business but other big sporting organizations and look after big name players and find out what is it that makes them get the best out of those athletes, and whatever lessons they give, obviously don't use them all, but because they're probably not relevant at times to rugby, but they're obviously lessons that they do give me and shown me or shared with me that I use as a coach in a rugby environment.
Are there any lessons or advice that you can remember that are top of mind that really impacted you that you can share with us?
Not from an individual. I suppose the one lesson that but the one sort of phrase that I'll never forget is that there's a book, The Art of War, by a guy called Sun Tzu, who basically, there was a quote in there that said, if you react to your opposition, you're in a position of weakness, and if he reacts to you, you're in a position of strength. And I think that that's something that I sort of always think about when we're delivering teams and picking teams is that if you start changing your team for who you're playing against, or you change the way you play for who you're playing against, or you start worrying about what you should be doing in order to beat the opposition, as opposed to them worrying about what they should be doing to beat you, then then you're in a position of weakness. So that comes down to the way you manage your team, the way you select it, the way you approach the game, the way you prepare, the way you train, what you say to them, what you show them before the game. And so that has a domino effect on all those things as well, Jason. So, there's not, as I said, not one person, but a thing like that is obviously big in the way that I do things, because I believe that you've always got to be in a position of strength where you can control the things that you can control. And that shows confidence. And I think that shows players that if you've got confidence and you've got, the sort of, if they sense that you're not all over the place and that you've got direction, then they get a lot of security and direction out of that as well. So, yeah, I mean that for me, just as I said, in every decision you make about who you're picking, how you're going to play, why you're going to play like that, what you're going to do before the game, all those things have a stabilizing effect on your group of players, and that's what you're going to try and get to every week, is that they feel comfortable about going into a rugby situation, because whether we like it or not, it's like a war. It's like two teams plotting against each other, and you've got to go in a position of strength every time.
Well, that is such a powerful quote, and I think for the game of rugby, for the game of life as well, it can determine so much. You mentioned The Art of War. Are there any other books that have impacted you that you think other people should read, that have really helped you or defined how you think about things?
Look, I've read a lot. So there's a book that's called Bounce, which was a story about a table tennis player who became a champion, and he played in the garage. His parents bought him a table tennis table, and he had to play in a garage. It was smaller so he had to play close to the table, which ended up his skill set became much better than it did had he played in a big garage where he could run backwards and actually have more time to play the ball. His eye-hand coordination. So that was a book where I just, again, realized the kind of training you do for a player and the environment you try and create is also important, because it has an effect on the outcome that you get of your athlete. Good to Great's a good book. Outliers, it's a story about young boys who are older in their age groups and they just dominate. They get the best coaching from a young group, and because they get better coaching, they become better players. And because they become better players, they always stay in the A teams. And it's quite interesting that boys who are born in the first 6 months of the year generally are the ones who are the better sports people, because they're 6 months older than their peers. So again, those are the ones that come to mind. There are obviously other books that I've read, whether it's Rod McQueen's book or whether it's Clive Woodward's book or whether it's Martin Johnson's book. I've read Lance Armstrong's book. It's not about the bike, and I think that again, it's all those stories that have happened to those top guys that I take little pieces out of and try and, as I said, use them in the teams that I coach, and maybe use those scenarios and those examples to bring out the best in the players that I have. But those are lessons, as I said. Bounce, the little boy who had to play in a confined area, and the skill set he had to develop obviously made him the best. And that goes true to the way that you create an environment for the players in your group. So the way we train definitely has an effect on how you get an outcome of your group when they play at a higher level.
I'm glad that you brought up outliers, because I wanted to ask you about the 10,000 hour rule and hard work and actually training. Do you see that, because there are all these stories about Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, all the great players that just train. Do you see that with great players as well, that they spend a lot of extra time training? I know Percy used to kick a lot of balls after practice, was the story. And is there a level where there's overtraining?
Well, look, let me say that there's one thing that I learned in Australia again, and many things I have, but that's the one thing that's, again, reaffirmed in my life, is that the way they train here, they can't afford not to train harder than anybody, because they have less players. As I said, they compete with all the other sporting codes. They only have a small talent pool, so they've got to spend a lot of time on training and repeating things that maybe we take for granted. So I have no doubt that that 10,000 hour rule is exactly that. But I suppose the challenge of a coach is how you put those 10,000 hours into play. You know, it's is it monotonous and doing it over and over? And I think in the old days that the people would have believed that is that the only way you're going to do it is by doing that skill. I suppose with technology now and with sports science the way it is now, there are other ways in which you can spend those 10,000 hours and develop a better athlete. And you know, the things that I think about, Jason, we have a program that we use with a box called iGym, which is you can play on your computer and improve your eye skills, which means your depth perception and your peripheral vision improve, which means your skills can improve on the field because your vision gets so much better. Now, I mean, again, that's part of the 10,000 hours. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I'm one of those old school coaches who believes the more time you spend on that activity and the more, you know, one of the phrases I have in my coaching book is repetition, repetition, repetition. And the reason for that is the more times you're in that situation, the better you'll actually be able to do it in the game situation. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely the way to go. Is there's no shortcuts for hard work, you know.
Jake, you also mentioned in Malcolm Gladwell's book, he talks about the ice hockey players and how they're born in the start of the year. When I read that, I was actually quite interested, and I looked at the Springbok squad that went to the last World Cup, and it was quite interesting. 50% of the players were born in April, May, and June. So half the squad were born in 3 months, but it wasn't at the start of the year, and most of those were also were playing for the Bulls. I don't know if they were born in Pretoria or whatever. But there's definitely a trend there, and I actually interviewed Malcolm Gladwell and asked him. So he said he'd investigate it, but I don't think he's going to. But it was just interesting for me that there was such a large majority of the squad born in 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have that stat, but I mean, as I said, if you read that book Outliers, and it's true. I mean, as a dad of 2 boys, there's no doubt both my kids are born in December. So, I mean, there's no doubt that boys are born early in the year always have. I mean, they physically develop much quicker, and therefore they play in the A teams. And once they play in the A teams, they get better coaching and that the catch up. I mean, that's one of the sort of, and again, that's part of the coaching is sometimes to identify a boy is probably a little bit younger, but if he had the same coaching and the same opportunities, he'd become so much better. And you know, the bottom line is about how quickly you can get that guy in the system, because I think that the longer he stays out of that system, the much tougher it is for him actually to catch up to the other players who've had that good coaching and have developed in good teams and played with good players all the time. It's much tougher for the guy who stayed out of that system to actually catch up.
Okay. Are your boys still fetching your beers?
Yep, they are. They are.
Jake, I wanted to ask you, do you have any personal quirks, anything you're compulsive about or that you do differently to others, that you think about differently or just kind of makes you stand out as different from everyone else?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything that I do purposefully. I mean, I'm sure that if you ask players that I've had, they'd probably tell you there are things that I did that or that I do that they would pick up. But there's nothing that I do that I sort of try and make it my mantra, or I try and make it my signature. You know, I mean, I am who I am, Jason. I think at the end of the day, I suppose that's what I try and do is just be who I am. As whenever I'm in the rugby world and wherever I'm with the team, then at least they know what they're getting. You know.
If you could meet an 18-year-old version of yourself, or even speak to your boys, what advice would you give yourself or give to your kids about how to live life?
Well, I have met 18-year-old boys, and I've got boys 16 and 20. So, I mean, the advice I give them, I suppose, is that they must, 2 things people don't enjoy is spoiled kids and bullies. And, I suppose if anyone ever bumped into them and said, "What did your dad always say to you?" They would say, "Your dad doesn't like bullies and spoiled kids," because the reality is those are 2 traits that no one enjoys. And that should be the advice that I'd continue to tell them is just remember, that those are things that around the world, doesn't matter where you are, people don't warm to those sort of attributes.
That's such good advice as well. Jake, what do you think is the meaning of life? What is this all about while we're here?
Well, I suppose, again, it's quite simple. I suppose it's we have, Jace, because we've got to get to heaven, my friend. That's the reality, That's what it's all about. I think the way we I probably wouldn't have said that to you a few years ago. I would have said it's here to make sure we do our best we can. But I suppose at the end of the day, it's about getting to heaven. It's about how we live our lives here to make sure that, that there's an eternal life. So, again, I think that it doesn't matter what you do and what field you're in, that's probably the things you've got to focus on the most. And then when you do that, everything else falls into place.
Okay. And am I right in my understanding that you recently in the last few years became a Christian? Are you still a Christian? Is that a big part of your life?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say a big part because it's not as big as I'd like it to be. But yes, I mean, it is something that changed significantly. I think that one of the things that hit home after the World Cup is that one can in the world of rugby tend to become bulletproof or tend to think you're bigger than you are or you should be or could be. And I suppose all that does, it just reflected a little bit or hit home to me after that at the end of the day, it's not about what you've done or what you think you've done. It's about how you live your life. So, yeah, I mean, it is something that I'm not as strong as I should be. And that doesn't mean that I'm not focusing on it. But it is something that I'm really more mindful of now than I was when I was sucked into the whole rugby world,
This is something that I think is quite important to know and this is a question for South Africans and everybody around the world, and it's really looking at how we can make this world a better place through our own personal actions on a daily basis. What is something that every South African can do today, tomorrow, the next day, in a small way to make our country better?
Jay, so look, I mean, again, I think that one of the things that South Africans should do, and I'm talking now as a South African who's living miles away, is just do the best you can in South Africa and try and make it a positive place. I think that often what happens when you're sucked into South Africa there, one tends to become a bit negative or one finds fault in everything. When you get here, people say, in South Africa this and South Africa that, and I suppose a message from a South African to South Africans is that one has to just try and be positive all the time. I think that the easiest thing is to become negative and the easiest thing is to find fault. I suppose the hardest thing is to go through every day just trying to be a better guy and make sure everyone's positive.
Okay. What does the future hold for you? What do you aspire or your goals going forward? There's been a lot of talk in the press about you coaching Australia. Are you even thinking that I mean, you've been attached to every coaching job with the Lions and the English team. Are you thinking that far ahead, or are you taking a kind of a seasonal or your term with the Brumbies as a short term? Where do you want to go to? What do you want to do? Because you have achieved so much already as well.
Look, Jace, I think that you've summed up is that I'm always going to be linked to every job in the world. And I think that's like the same as Graham Henry. From now on in, Graham Henry, I mean, he's now with the Argentinian team and there's talk about he was going to help the Blues. And, so I think one of the things that's happened when you win a World Cup is people always tag your name onto teams. And there's two reasons. One is because they obviously think that you can add value. And two is it also increases the profile of the jobs that they're trying to put out there. So, it's obviously very nice that your name gets bantered around. It's obviously very nice people talk about you. So, that'll always happen whether you push it or not. It's always going to come from the media and from that side of the world or whatever. So, but my immediate thing is I'm happy in Australia. I've committed myself to the Brumbies. I've committed myself to getting this franchise back on track and getting them to be the best in not only in Australia but in the competition. Where does it hold for me? I have no idea, because as I said to you, you would have said to me 5 years ago, or even at the World Cup in 2007, that your next coaching job would be in Australia coaching the Brumbies. I mean, I would have said you're kidding me. So, I'm not sure where I'll be in the next couple of years after I'm finished my job here, but I do have aspirations of coaching at international level again. I know that in 4 years' time I will be a much better coach than I am now, purely by the life lessons I'm learning from miles away from South Africa, out of my comfort zone, coaching in another environment where rugby is not the number one sport, in a different culture. So, I would like to get back and coach again, and I'd like to win another World Cup. I think that, I had a dream that I wanted to win one. I have a dream now that I'd like to win 2 World Cups. So, I'm not sure where it's going to be. I'm not sure which team it's going to be. Who knows? But, I obviously I'm young enough to coach at least another 2-3 World Cups, and I'm hoping that I'll have another crack at winning another one. So, I'm not sure where, but I'm sure that wherever I'm meant to be, I will be.
Well, I definitely hope that it's with the Springboks, because there's no doubt that you probably will win another World Cup, and I hope it's not with Australia. Although this is this is a funny thing as well. I don't think there are a lot of South African men that are supporting the Brumbies now by virtue of you coaching them and what you've done, and I think a couple of years ago nobody would ever have thought that was possible. Jake, just a little final rugby question. What are your thoughts on the current Springbok squad, and how the Springboks are doing, and Heineken and in the new role?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the Boks, they've done. When I say, I was almost going to say they've surprised people, because I think people were always under the impression that losing Victor and Bakkies and Dani Rousseau and Farid Dupriya and and all those big names was going to have a sort of time frame for those players to actually find their feet and get a bit of a synergy going. And I think the surprise has been how quickly the Boks have adapted to getting new players in and being competitive like they are. I think it's wonderful to see that South Africans have gone on and I mean, it doesn't matter whether the people say that England are rebuilding. I mean, the reality is we probably in the beginning stages and are in the beginning stages of a new team. So I'm thinking that Heineke and the coaching staff must be really happy. They've won two tests against England. They've got the third one coming up. They haven't had Skalkberger in the team who's available to them. They haven't had Andries Becker who's available to them. They've as I said, they've a lot of guys talk about Heinrich Brousseau could still come in. So Johan Smith's not available this year. So all in all, I think that there's no doubt that the Boks side can get better, even when those other players come in. But it's been fantastic. Heineke has waited a long time to coach the team. He's had his name on the shortlist and has been on the shortlist for probably 3 coaches. So from Rudolph, myself, and Peter, he's basically been there and thereabouts. So I'm sure that he was dying to have a shot at it, and he's done well at it. I mean, he's won at it, and now he's unbeaten as the coach. So I think things are all healthy in South African rugby. I think that, as I said to you earlier as well, Jace, there's no doubt that from outside looking in, it doesn't seem as though all the interference or all the sort of things that other coaches had to endure are probably as prevalent as they are now, and maybe that's a good thing, because maybe that's allowing this new generation of player, new generation of coach, and the new generation of Springboks to actually have a full crack at becoming the best in the world again. And I suppose that's what all coaches and all people involved in Springbok rugby and people who've been involved in Springbok rugby really want to see at the end of the day. So, yeah, I mean, it's miles away, but it's always nice to watch the Boks play, and always nice now to watch the Boks winning and being successful.
I have a thought that I'd like to see or get your opinion on. When you took over the Springboks, you appointed John Smith as your captain 6 months before the team even got together. Heineke's gone a completely different route, where he's named his captain, I think it was about a week before the first test, and he hasn't confirmed the captain. Do you understand that different approach, and how do you think it will affect the team?
Look, I don't know why, and I don't know what he was thinking, and again, it's not important for me to know that. I mean, I think at the end of the day, he would have had a plan, and he would have had a reason why that happened. Again, Jace, from outside, I think that there was a lot of talk that Farid Dupriya was going to come and play, a lot of talk that Victor was going to come and play, and maybe the reason he delayed the naming of the captain was because he wasn't sure whether he'd get the services of Victor or whether he'd get the services of Farid, and I suppose he was buying time in that. He didn't want to announce someone based on the fact that he'd either not get them or announce someone and then get someone else that he thought would be a better captain. So, I think he's probably done the wise thing by saying, let's pick a captain now. I'm not gonna pick a long-term captain. I'm going to pick a captain who I think can do the job for the tests against England. Gives him time in the next couple of months to reassess about not only his captain but about the rest of the players who are going to be fit and available for the end of year tour. And I'm sure then also he'll have a lot clearer idea about what sort of captain he's looking for. So I don't think anyone needs to read into the fact that that I did it that way, or I picked a captain early and he didn't do it the same way. So therefore, does that look like he doesn't know who his captain was? I think that it was just the way things panned out for Heineke, and I mean, who can quibble? Because the reality is, John de Villiers has come in. He's won 2 tests out of 2. So, I mean, all things being equal, he's obviously done a great job
and led from the front. Jake, who do you think I should interview next? And it could be across sports, business, life, anything. And importantly, what do you think I should ask them? What one question?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to say to you, Jason, I think you should interview Peter de Villiers and don't ask him one question. Go through exactly the same rigmarole you've gone through with me, and I'd like to see what his answers are. You know?
I didn't want to bring him up, but gosh, he's done a great job with his book. I don't know, throwing out the most wonderful things about everybody.
Yeah, I know, and you know, in a lot of ways, that doesn't also do you any favors, because I remember that part of the problem of, I suppose, why I picked it up is that the things I said in my book, you know, people probably weren't too chuffed at SA Rugby, you know. So, unfortunately, that's the territory you live in, you know. You're either going to tell them the story or you're not going to tell them the story, you know. And one had to tell it the way it was. I mean, there's no ways I could, and I'm sure, like the same for Peter, he can't really make it up if it's not what he's thinking that it was, you know. So. It's amazing, though. I suppose that's, looking back, Jace, I mean, I suppose, again, and here I am talking to you and you're asking me questions about the tenure. You said to me earlier, what is the things about South African rugby? I just wish that we all didn't go through the same, because it's almost like Rudolph went through the same thing, maybe with a different outcome. You know, Nick Mallett went through the same thing with a different outcome. You know, Peter's gone through the same thing. Ian McIntosh has gone through the same thing. I think, you know, what I suppose, if I had to rewind the clock and say one thing I'd like to change, is that people who leave should try and leave through the front door and not always try and run out the back door, you know.
Which is a whole different discussion, and it's so unfortunate. Jake, I was going to end there, but I actually want to ask you, final question. Rugby is filled with great stories, great people, interesting characters. Is there one great rugby story, like you mentioned earlier with Doc Craven, or something that you can share with us that is kind of your favorite rugby story or experience?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. I've got plenty of stories. I suppose the one that I always tell about, which is a true story that happened, because a lot of people have got, you know, they've obviously got stories that get told, and people are not sure if they ever happened, you know. But the one story that, and it's not a really massive story, but the one thing that I sort of got great pleasure out of in the time that I was the coach was, remember young Skalkberger in the change room once, and, you know, he was at the peak of his career in my first year. He won the Player of the Year that year as the best player in the world. So, and I remember it was in the first year. I remember sitting next to him and asking him about Oosterrand, and I just said to him, "What do you think?" Because at that stage, also, you know, he'd been around a long time, and I'd brought him back from retirement, and you know, that obviously a lot of speculation in the media about whether he was past it, etc., etc. And I remember Skalk saying to me, you know, he said to me, you know, I'm so glad that he warms up in our change room and not in their change room, because he's a meneer, you know. And I remember after the game getting him to tell that story to us, because I just couldn't believe, you know, sometimes we take things for granted about how those senior players and what they mean. That's the story I was telling you just now, Jace, about walking through the front door when you finish and not running out the back door, you know. And one of the things I sort of try to do in the time, and I'm using the story about Os, is I let him play his last game at Newlands before we left, and I told the crowd that's the last time he played in South Africa. His last game was a World Cup final, which again is a great attribute for him to leave as a 36-year-old playing 80 minutes in the World Cup final. And, you know, as I said, I think that story that I sort of relate to that about Os being in the side and what he meant to the boys is unique, because the gist of the story goes, Jason, that when we ran out for the World Cup final, I could sense that in that last 5 minutes before we ran out, before the kickoff, I think it hit home to everybody about what Os had achieved. You know, we always speak about winning a World Cup. We speak about he won it in 95, but I think that those other 21 players who were in the change room for the first time realized what he had achieved and what a meneer he actually was in the Springbok setup, because for that split second, they realized they were 80 minutes away from achieving something that he had achieved literally, you know, 15 years before that, so 12 years before that. So as I said, I think that those are stories that I think about. Is having Skulk saying, "I'm so glad he's here. He's a meneer," but he said it. I don't think it hit home to him until literally 5 minutes before the kickoff in 2007, when he realized what a meneer he actually was. And I think those are the stories that make teams special. Is when you have those sort of bonds and that sort of feeling in amongst the team about what certain players have achieved.
Yeah, and you forced me to ask another question now. Um, has there been a great team talk that has really stood out for you, halftime or before a game, that has really pumped the guys up? And can you share one with us?
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose there are a few, and they, because of the significance of the time that they were given, and the three that I sort of think about. One is the very first team talk I ever gave was almost identical to the talk I gave them before the World Cup final, and it was about being brave. And it was about a story about a young guy who was in the army and had to stay at his post and basically protect his post, even though he knew he was going to die, you know. And I said to them about being brave and playing and never leaving anything out on the field, making sure that if you think you're scared, just to understand about young 18-year-old boys who've died, knowing that they had no other option, you know. And as I said, the theme of that story, both on the first test I ever played, because I was scared, and I'm sure they were all scared about what the expectation was and what was going to happen in the first test, and again, losing everything in 80 minutes of the World Cup final was something that I had to then, you know. And it's just, for some of them, I don't know if they ever remembered the first speech, but I'm sure that the message would have hit home, is about just being brave, about understanding that you're going to make mistakes, but be brave enough to make them in a World Cup final, because that will be the difference between winning and losing. You know, I don't want you to put your head in the hole and think that it's all going to go away. You've got to lift your head, and if they shoot you, they shoot you, but you got to be brave, you know. So that was the sort of thing that my first and almost my last game, because we only had one test after that. And then I suppose the other thing that I think about is I never really ever lost it with the players. I never really ever had to shout and scream and belittle them and that sort of thing. It wasn't my style. But there was a game in Perth where a couple of boys were busy wetting their hair at halftime and were more worried about what they were looking like. And I lost it a bit in terms of getting them to understand that it's not about, you know, whether they look all right. It's about how they play. And we ended up winning that game. So a lot of the boys came to me afterwards and said, you know, they weren't always the boys who were in the mirror, but a lot of the boys said, gee, you're upset and you made a massive statement. And as I said, we won that game. So, you know, those three team talks for me are probably ones that I remember because of the significance of what actually happened in those games.
Okay. Jake, thank you very much. That was awesome. You've given me so much of your time. You've given us so much insight and wisdom and inspiration. I really can't express how grateful I am.
It's a pleasure.
And please also thank your wife, Lindy, for me as well, for taking an hour and a half of your time.
No, it's fine, my friend. It's fine.
Jake, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, my friend. Okay, no, look after yourself and stay in touch, eh?
Cheers, bye.